The battlefield was roaring, not just with gunfire but with a sound no one expected. Soldiers looked up, thinking a fighter plane was diving overhead. But the noise came from the ground. Across the muddy fields, American tanks thundered forward. Faster, louder, unlike anything the enemy had ever seen, because inside those steel beasts beat the heart of an airplane. This is the unbelievable story of how U.S. engineers turned aviation power into a weapon that changed ground warfare forever. The year was 1941. Across the Atlantic, thunder rolled over Europe as German tanks carved through continent after continent. Their steel beasts, Panzer III, A4, and soon the fearsome Tiger, seemed unstoppable. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the United States had only just awakened to a global war that was rewriting every rule of combat. In Washington, factory lights burned through the night. America's industrial engine was roaring to life, but on the battlefield, its armored forces lagged far behind. The M3 Lee and the early M4 Sherman could barely keep up with German firepower, and their gasoline engines groaned under the strain of mud, snow, and long marches. Engineers faced a humiliating truth. The world's most industrialized nation had tanks that were powerful on paper, yet sluggish and underarmed compared to their Axis counterparts. Reports from Britain warned that American armor, once deployed, would need to move faster than anything before it, or risk being torn apart by the 88mm guns waiting across the hedgerows of Europe. The challenge wasn't only about armor thickness or gun caliber, it was about power. Tanks needed an engine that could haul 30 tons of steel across deserts, mountains, and swamps, reliably every single day. And in 1942, American engineers realized something radical. The answer might not lie on the ground at all. What if we gave a tank the heart of an airplane? The question sounded absurd at first. Planes demanded lightweight engines built for altitude, not armor. But when the U.S. Army Ordnance Department surveyed existing designs, they saw no other choice. Aircraft factories had a surplus of proven high-horsepower radial engines just waiting to be used. The Wright R-975 Whirlwind, a 9-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, had already powered legendary aircraft like the Curtiss Hawk and early B-17 variants. It was reliable, compact, and produced a roar that pilots trusted. Now, engineers wondered, could that same roar push a tank instead of a plane? At the Wright Aeronautical Plant in New Jersey, test benches echoed with the rhythmic coughing of the R-975. Mechanics modified cooling fins, adjusted carburetors, and designed heavy-duty housing so the radial could be dropped into the back of a Sherman's hull. Every wrench turn was a gamble. One mistake and the entire machine could overheat or explode. The experiment soon drew attention from the U.S. Army's Armored Force Board. Colonel Elmer Gray reportedly remarked, "If it runs half as well on the ground as it does in the air, we might just change the game." His words captured the spirit of the time. Bold, impatient, and willing to break conventions. Yet skeptics were everywhere. Ground crews feared maintenance nightmares. Pilots joked that the tanks would start flying away. Even within General Motors and Chrysler, engineers doubted that an air-cooled radial could survive the choking dust of North Africa or the freezing cold of Belgium. The first prototype arrived in the spring of 1942 at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Painted in dull olive drab, it looked like any other Sherman M4 until it started. The instant the engine turned over, a deafening rumble filled the test field. Observers instinctively glanced upward, thinking a P-40 fighter had flown overhead. What they saw instead was a 30-ton tank lunging forward with surprising agility. Its radial engine spun at 200 RPM, propelling the vehicle to speeds that stunned everyone present. One witness later wrote, "It didn't growl like a tank. It screamed like a sky engine trapped in armor." The tests weren't perfect. After a few miles, the engine overheated. Air cooling systems designed for high altitude struggled at ground level. But the results were promising enough to spark something bigger: a production order. The M4 Sherman would officially carry the Wright R-975 radial as its beating heart. This was not just a technical adjustment, it was a philosophical one. Instead of chasing heavier armor like the Germans, America doubled down on speed, reliability, and numbers. The Sherman would be the everyman's tank. Simple to build, easy to repair, and fast enough to strike where least expected. By late 1942, production lines in Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland were fitting radial engines into hundreds of Shermans each month. The aviation industry had become the armor industry's lifeline. Crates labeled aircraft parts, handle with care, now rolled toward tank assembly lines. In England, American tank crews training for Operation Torch felt the difference immediately. Sergeant Ray Hollins of the 2nd Armored Division recalled, "When that engine kicked, it was like sitting on a thundercloud. You didn't drive it, you rode it." For young crews, the sound was terrifying and reassuring all at once. The new power plant gave the Sherman a top speed of about 25 miles per hour. Not lightning fast by modern standards, but enough to outmaneuver heavier Axis armor. More importantly, it gave the U.S. Army a template for mass production unmatched by any other nation. Critics in Berlin scoffed when intelligence reports mentioned the airplane engine Shermans. Nazi propaganda dismissed them as weak machines built by amateurs. But within months, those same tanks would race across North Africa's deserts, forcing Rommel's men into retreat after retreat. Every design came with trade-offs. The radial's high center of gravity sometimes made the Sherman wobble on rough terrain. Maintenance crews complained about access panels that barely fit around the circular engine block. Yet, compared to the complexity of a German Maybach engine, the R-975 was blissfully simple. The U.S. Army soon realized another advantage: spare parts. Because the R-975 shared components with aircraft still in production, supply chains could deliver replacements quickly. A tank immobilized by a blown cylinder could be fixed in hours, not days. War is rarely kind to innovation, but sometimes necessity turns madness into brilliance. The United States, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, had stumbled upon a secret weapon not of destruction, but of efficiency. The skies were feeding the ground war. As 1943 opened, Allied strategists prepared for the invasions of Sicily and Italy. Mobility would be everything. Commanders needed tanks that could cross long distances quickly, climb hills, and pivot through narrow mountain roads. Once again, the Wright radial answered the call. Reports from Tunisia told stories of tanks climbing inclines previously considered impossible. Pilots passing overhead recognized the distinctive engine note below. One RAF flyer joked over the radio, "Sounds like my old Whirlwind down there, only it's not flying." At home, newspapers never mentioned the airplane engine secret. For security reasons, the Army simply referred to it as the M4 power plant. But among tank crews, the legend grew. They called it the Flying Tank. The name stuck, half joke, half badge of honor. To the average soldier, what mattered wasn't engineering. It was survival. The radial engine's reliability meant fewer breakdowns in combat zones, and that reliability saved lives. As one mechanic wrote in a field letter, "It's loud as hell, but it never quits." Meanwhile, the Axis had taken a different path. Germany's obsession with engineering perfection produced the Tiger and Panther, armored giants, but nightmares to maintain. Each required precision parts and lengthy repairs. In contrast, the Sherman's airplane heart kept beating even when abused. By mid-1943, the contrast was stark. American factories churned out 2,000 tanks a month. German plants barely a fraction of that. The U.S. could replace losses overnight. The secret wasn't just industrial might, it was a clever use of existing technology repurposed from the skies. Still, the idea faced its most crucial test: combat under fire. The deserts of North Africa had proved promising, but Europe would be a different beast. Muddy fields, narrow lanes, and ambush-rich hedgerows. Could the radial keep its cool when shells began to fly? Engineers back home refined airflow ducts and added armored grills to prevent shrapnel damage. They learned that in winter, the R-975 performed even better. Its air-cooled system avoided the frozen radiators that plagued liquid-cooled engines. What started as improvisation was becoming strategic advantage. "Speed is life," General George S. Patton declared during training maneuvers in California. "Armor that moves wins. Armor that waits dies." His divisions would soon carry those words into France with the Wright radial roaring behind them. As the D-Day invasion loomed, shipyards in New York and Boston filled with Shermans waiting to sail. Their engines were tested one last time before being sealed for transit. Workers described the scene as an orchestra of thunder, hundreds of airplane hearts singing from inside tanks. No one could predict how those hearts would perform on the killing fields of Normandy, but everyone sensed something had changed. America had built not just a weapon, but an idea that adaptability could triumph over perfection. And somewhere, in a dusty hangar in New Jersey, an engineer tightened the last bolt on another R-975 assembly. He smiled, wiped the grease from his hands, and said to a colleague, "If it can make a plane fly, it can make a tank win." The thunder of engines faded into the night, but soon the world would hear it again, across Normandy's beaches, through the French countryside, and deep into Germany itself. The idea that once sounded insane was about to prove its worth in fire and steel. What began as desperation was turning into dominance. The Sherman's airplane heart was ready for war. By the summer of 1943, the flying tanks of America had already begun their journey across the Atlantic. Freighters packed with Sherman tanks rolled into British ports, their cargo holds filled with the hum of hundreds of preserved Wright radial engines. British dock workers stared in disbelief as the tanks were unloaded. Even before the war zone, their strange circular rear casing set them apart from anything Europe had seen. The British called them whirlwinds, after the Wright engine's original aircraft name. When American mechanics performed engine tests on English soil, villagers miles away heard the unfamiliar sound. "It's not a tank," one farmer reportedly said. "It's a plane pretending to be one." On testing grounds near Salisbury Plain, British and American crews ran comparative trials. The Sherman's radial-powered models outpaced both the British Cromwell and the American diesel variants. The acceleration startled observers. One officer noted, "It behaves like it wants to take off." In a war defined by heavy armor, this was speed unlike anything else. But speed alone would not win battles. Engineers were still refining the delicate balance between power and endurance. In the open desert, airflow was plentiful, and the air-cooled radial excelled. Yet in the European climate, mud and dust could choke its intakes. To counter this, U.S. engineers installed new filtration systems. Lessons learned from Tunisia, paid for in grit and sand. The M4A1, powered by the R-975, became the workhorse of the Allied advance. Soldiers soon developed affection for its quirks. It roared loudly, sometimes enough to announce its presence long before appearing over a ridge. Tankers joked that the noise alone could scare enemy scouts away. But deep down, they knew that same noise gave them confidence. The sound of power they could count on. In June 1944, Operation Overlord began. The beaches of Normandy erupted in smoke and fire, and among the thousands of vehicles that came ashore were dozens of Shermans with airplane hearts. The landings were chaotic, the terrain brutal. Yet as the first waves pushed inland, the radial engine proved its worth. It kept running, even when half-submerged in water and sand. Corporal Henry Miles of the 751st Tank Battalion recalled in an interview years later, "When we came off that beach, I thought the engine would drown. It didn't even cough. We just kept moving." That resilience made all the difference during those crucial first days when any stall could mean death. Once beyond the beaches, the Shermans began their advance through the French countryside. German tank crews, confident in their Tigers and Panthers, quickly realized they were fighting an enemy that moved too fast to predict. The radial-powered tanks darted through hedgerows and flanked positions before the heavy guns could even turn. A captured German report described the phenomenon bluntly. The American tanks advance with unexpected rapidity. Their engines sound like aircraft. We misjudged their approach. It was not hyperbole. The sound truly echoed that of a low-flying plane, confusing both enemy troops and local civilians alike. For American tank crews, the experience was equally surreal. Inside, the noise was deafening. Communication relied on intercom headsets to cut through the radial's constant drone. Yet, amid the chaos, many said they grew attached to that very sound. It was proof the engine was alive, proof they could still fight another day. In the bocage country of Normandy, where narrow lanes and thick hedges turned battles into close-quarter duels, the radial's torque became a secret weapon. Shermans could lunge forward, pivot, and withdraw faster than their heavier German counterparts. In those moments, speed was survival. Lieutenant Robert Ellison described one encounter near St. Lo. "We came face to face with a Panther at about 70 yards. We hit reverse and swung around faster than it could aim. The engine screamed. It felt like wings. The crew escaped, returned fire from the flank, and destroyed the Panther. They credited the airplane heart for saving their lives." Behind the front lines, mechanics worked tirelessly to keep the engines running. Surprisingly, maintenance demands were lower than expected. The radial's design allowed easy access to cylinders and plugs, and many crews became amateur mechanics overnight. "You didn't need a genius to fix it," one sergeant joked. "Just a wrench and a good ear." Supply lines benefited enormously. Since the same engine parts were used in training aircraft, spare components were available in abundance. In the chaotic logistics of 1944 Europe, that abundance translated directly into operational strength. A broken tank could return to combat within hours, an advantage the Germans could only envy. Still, the Shermans had limits. Their armor remained thinner than the Tigers, and the 75 mm gun sometimes lacked punch against heavy frontal plates. Yet commanders realized something crucial. War wasn't just about individual duels. It was about movement, timing, and numbers. The radial engines made those numbers unstoppable. As Allied divisions swept through France, reports poured in from every front. Shermans were crossing rivers, storming villages, and outpacing supply trucks. The very idea that tanks could race was almost absurd, yet it was happening daily. One British officer quipped, "Patton doesn't need wings, he's got Shermans." German officers could hardly believe what they were seeing. Their intelligence estimates assumed Allied armor would crawl through the countryside. Instead, American columns appeared days earlier than predicted, striking from unexpected directions. "Their tanks move like cavalry," one stunned German major wrote in a field diary. This mobility reshaped entire strategies. Instead of grinding frontal assaults, American units began using sweeping maneuvers, cutting off supply lines and encircling pockets of resistance. Every mile gained was a victory born from horsepower. Meanwhile, back in the United States, factories were hitting record production numbers. The partnership between aviation and armor was unprecedented. General Motors, Continental, and Wright collectively produced tens of thousands of radial engines. Women on assembly lines riveted cylinder heads and tuned carburetors, knowing their work would soon thunder across Europe. Propaganda reels captured footage of tank columns rolling endlessly across fields, accompanied by triumphant orchestral music. The narrators never mentioned the airplane engines, but the roar told the story itself. To viewers, the Shermans looked unstoppable, and in many ways they were. By late 1944, the Allies had liberated most of France. The Shermans, their airplane hearts still beating strong, pushed toward the German border. Mechanics noted that after months of continuous combat, many engines still ran smoothly. Few had expected that. What began as a risky improvisation had become a symbol of dependability. Winter came, bringing one of the harshest seasons in Europe's memory. Snow blanketed the Ardennes, and engines across the continent froze. But the radial Shermans refused to die. Air-cooled and free from the liquid radiators that cracked in the cold, they roared to life while others stalled. In the Battle of the Bulge, that resilience proved decisive. Tank Commander George Riley recalled, "It was 20 below, and we thought nothing would start. Then the engine caught. First try. That sound was hope." The Shermans spearheaded counterattacks that halted the German advance. Once again, the plane engine made history. Meanwhile, German tanks, masterpieces of engineering, began to suffer from their own perfection. Their engines required high-octane fuel that was running out. Their weight crushed bridges. Their complexity demanded mechanics the Reich could no longer spare. Against that backdrop, the simplicity of America's flying tanks was almost poetic. Historian Stephen Zaloga later wrote, "The Sherman's greatest weapon wasn't its gun or its armor. It was its engine's ability to keep the war moving." That insight captures the true heart of this story. America didn't win by building the strongest machine, but by keeping it alive and moving when nothing else could. Inside every Sherman crew, the bond between man and machine deepened. They named their tanks Sky Chariot, Thunderbug, Flying Betty. They joked that one day they'd take off for real. But behind the laughter lay respect. The engine was more than machinery. It was a heartbeat that carried them through fear. Across liberated France, civilians gathered to watch columns of Shermans rumble through towns. Children covered their ears, laughing at the deafening noise. One French villager told an American translator, "When we heard that sound, we knew you were coming." It became the sound of liberation. Not every story was heroic. The radial's power came with danger. Its high-mounted design made the tank slightly taller, an easy target. In muddy ground, its weight distribution could cause rollovers. Many crews paid the price for speed with risk. Yet, few would have traded it for the alternative. As the war dragged into 1945, the Shermans with airplane hearts marched into Germany itself. They crossed the Rhine under fire, their engines echoing across the river valleys. Soldiers described the surreal feeling of hearing hundreds of radial engines revving together, like a squadron of aircraft charging on the ground. To the Germans, that sound became a signal of inevitability. The more they heard it, the closer defeat loomed. For the Allies, it was the opposite, a rhythm of progress, each roar marking another step toward victory. By April, the end was near. Berlin was crumbling, and the American armor rolled eastward with unstoppable momentum. The air and the ground had become one symphony of mechanical power. The experiment that began with a question, "What if we gave a tank the heart of an airplane?" had answered itself in triumph. And yet few of the men driving those tanks realized just how revolutionary their machines truly were. To them, it was simply what worked, what survived. But to historians, engineers, and generations to come, it became a lesson in innovation born from desperation. The sky had given the Earth its heart, and that heartbeat would echo far beyond 1945. Winter in Europe had given way to the chill of early spring, 1945. Across the shattered fields of western Germany, smoke hung low and thick. Columns of Shermans crept through the fog, their engines rumbling like the heartbeat of 1,000 planes trapped beneath the soil. Every man inside knew they were closing in on the Reich itself, and the enemy's most fearsome weapons waited ahead. Intelligence briefings spoke of Tiger IIs, the monstrous Königstiger, waiting near the Ruhr Valley. These tanks were nightmares on treads, 70 tons of steel, an 88mm gun capable of turning a Sherman into scrap from over a mile away. To face them head-on was suicide. Yet that's exactly what the Americans were about to do. Lieutenant Colonel John Randolph, commanding a mixed battalion of Sherman units, studied the map by lantern light. His orders were simple: cut the road to Remagen and hold it until reinforcements arrived. His men joked bitterly that simple orders in war usually meant impossible ones. But Randolph knew one thing: his tanks were fast, faster than the Germans expected. Speed and surprise, he told his crews that morning. That's how we'll win. Not by brute strength, by motion. Outside, engines began to turn over, filling the valley with that unmistakable roar, the sound of hundreds of Wright radials coughing into life. One mechanic whispered, "That's the sound of angels with dirty hands." The column moved out before dawn. Frost glittered on the armor plates, exhaust vapor billowing like breath from an army of beasts. The road wound through ruined villages where walls stood like broken teeth. Overhead, P-47 Thunderbolts circled, their engines sharing the same DNA as the tanks below, a strange family reunion between sky and earth. Around 800 hours, scouts reported movement ahead, a German armored group near a crossroads outside the town of Gummersbach. Randolph halted his column behind a ridge. Through binoculars, he saw them, silhouettes of massive Tiger IIs prowling near the church spire, their gray hulls glinting in the weak sun. "We'll go around them," said Randolph. "Circle wide through the orchard, hit their flank before they even know we're here." His radio crackled with affirmations. The crews revved up. The air was filled with mechanical thunder as the Shermans broke from cover. What followed would later be described as one of the strangest sounds of the war. To the Germans, it began like an air raid, the unmistakable drone of aircraft engines approaching fast. Soldiers looked up, scanning the skies, but nothing came from above. Instead, the roar grew louder, from the ground. The first Shermans burst through the trees, churning mud and snow. The Wright radial screamed at full throttle, echoing across the valley. The Tigers, confused for precious seconds, swung their massive guns toward the sound. But the Shermans were already in motion, darting, circling, flanking. Corporal Henry Miles, who had survived Normandy, led one of the lead tanks. "We were moving like we were flying," he later said. "That engine pulled us harder than anything I'd ever felt. The ground was shaking and the Germans couldn't track us fast enough." The Shermans struck from the side where the Tiger's armor was weakest. One, then another, exploded in a burst of fire and smoke. The battlefield turned into chaos. Steel against steel, deafening engines roaring like thunderclouds trapped in the valley. A German gunner shouted over the radio, "Sie kommen zu schnell!" "They're coming too fast!" It was the same disbelief that echoed across dozens of encounters that spring. The Allies weren't just advancing. They were storming forward at a pace that defied every tactical assumption. Randolph's battalion seized the crossroads within 20 minutes. The surviving German tanks withdrew under artillery cover, unable to reposition quickly enough. The Americans, exhilarated and stunned, realized they'd just done the unthinkable, outmaneuvered the Tigers in open combat. "It felt impossible," one crewman remembered. "You don't beat Tigers with Shermans. But that day, we did. And the only reason was that engine. It gave us wings." He smiled faintly at the memory, as if still hearing the engine's scream echoing through his bones. News of the skirmish spread through nearby divisions. Officers began to view the airplane-powered Shermans as a symbol of American ingenuity, proof that victory didn't always come from having the biggest gun, but from daring to move faster, think quicker, and fight differently. In the days that followed, similar clashes played out across Western Germany. The Shermans, often underestimated, outflanked heavy tanks and exploited gaps in retreating enemy lines. Their engines rarely failed. Mechanics joked that even if the war lasted another 10 years, the radials would still be running. The psychological effect was enormous. German troops began mistaking the sound of Sherman engines for approaching aircraft, panicking and taking cover. Allied units learned to use this to their advantage. revving their engines before assaults to sow confusion. A captured German lieutenant confessed during interrogation, "When we heard that sound, we thought the Americans had found a way to make their tanks fly." His words weren't far from the truth, metaphorically at least. On that battlefield, mobility was flight. The success of these engagements shifted Allied planning. Generals began integrating fast armor groups built around the R-975 Shermans to perform deep penetration maneuvers. It was a bold new tactic, echoing the very blitzkrieg methods once used by Germany, now turned against them. In mid-March, Patton's Third Army made its legendary dash across Germany. His armored divisions advanced nearly 100 miles in less than 48 hours, an impossible feat without the mobility the airplane engines provided. "Keep them fueled and keep them moving," Patton ordered. "We'll finish this before they even realize it's begun." Drivers slept at the wheel. Crews ate cold rations from their laps. The world blurred past at speeds few tankers had ever imagined. The air inside was suffocating, the noise unbearable. But none of it mattered. They were rewriting the rules of armored warfare in real time. Journalists embedded with Patton's forces described scenes of surreal velocity. One war correspondent wrote, "The Shermans didn't just move, they charged. They sounded like the sky itself had been unchained." His article ran in newspapers across America, though censors cut out any reference to the engine's origins. Even among the Allies, rumors spread. Some British officers believed the Americans had secretly developed hybrid air-ground vehicles. Others thought they'd tapped into jet technology. In truth, it was something far simpler and far more brilliant, repurposing what they already had. By the time the Allies reached the Rhine, German morale was collapsing. Their tanks were powerful, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. The Shermans, lighter and faster, swarmed across bridges, riverbanks, and forest paths. What they lacked in armor, they made up for in momentum. At Remagen, the famous Ludendorff Bridge still stood, a miracle of fate. American units rushed to secure it before the Germans could destroy it. Among them were several Sherman units with radial engines. Their approach was so rapid that enemy engineers were caught mid-preparation. The bridge was taken intact, a strategic miracle that accelerated the Allied invasion of Germany. "That engine got us there," said Captain Don Fowler, whose platoon reached the bridge first. "We were running on fumes, but the engine never gave up. When we crossed that bridge, we knew the war was ending, and maybe in some strange way, the sky helped us win it." For the men inside those tanks, every mile was a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The roar of the radial was both comfort and curse. It drowned out everything: the enemy, the gunfire, even their own thoughts. But as long as it roared, they knew they were alive. In one small village near Cologne, a Sherman platoon found itself ambushed by a hidden tiger. The first shell missed by inches, shaking the ground. The Sherman's driver floored it, the engine screaming. The tank leaped forward, sliding behind a stone wall. The crew returned fire, 2 shots, 1 hit, the tiger disabled. Against all odds, they survived. When asked later how they reacted so fast, the driver replied, "You don't think, you move. That engine makes you move before your brain catches up." His words captured the essence of what the R-975 had given them. Not just power, but instinctive motion. By April 1945, American armored divisions had surrounded the Ruhr Pocket, trapping hundreds of thousands of German troops. The once invincible Tiger divisions were now isolated relics. Many were abandoned for lack of fuel. The Shermans kept moving, their airplane hearts still beating strong. The sound of victory, it turned out, wasn't the whistle of bombs or the rattle of rifles. It was the steady, thunderous drone of thousands of radial engines pushing across a dying empire. As one German general admitted after surrender, "We underestimated your machines. We built monsters. You built runners. And runners always reach the finish first." The battles were brutal, the losses real, but the outcome undeniable. The experiment that had once seemed insane, mounting airplane engines on tanks, had become a legend of innovation, courage, and sheer industrial genius. On the last day of combat for Randolph's battalion, as they halted near the Elbe River, he stood atop his Sherman and looked across the horizon. Smoke from burning towns drifted in the distance, and beyond that, silence. He removed his helmet, listening to the idling hum of the engine below. "It carried us all the way," he murmured. The men didn't cheer. They just listened. The roar that had begun in New Jersey workshops years ago now echoed over conquered ground. It was more than the sound of victory. It was the sound of invention fulfilling its destiny. In that moment, no one thought of schematics or horsepower or factory quotas. They thought of home, of survival, of how something built for the sky had brought them safely across the earth. The heart of the airplane had done its job, and as the engines finally shut down, their echoes lingered. A reminder that sometimes the craziest ideas don't just work. They win wars. When the war finally ended in May 1945, silence returned to Europe. A silence so deep that the roar of engines seemed almost mythical. The skies no longer trembled with bombers, and the ground no longer quaked with tanks. Yet, for those who had lived inside that noise, the absence felt strange, almost wrong. For thousands of American tankers, the war had ended, but the echo of the Wright radial still hummed in their memories. Across occupied Germany, rows of Shermans sat idle beside roads and in open fields, their engines cooling for the last time. Mechanics and soldiers wandered among them, uncertain what to feel. These machines had carried them across continents, from the deserts of North Africa to the heart of the Reich. Each engine bore scratches, bullet marks, and hastily painted names: Lucky Strike, Angel's Breath, Flying Betty. The U.S. Army began its massive demobilization, collecting and cataloging equipment. Many Shermans would be scrapped, others shipped to allies. But a few were kept running, used for training or demonstration. Officers noted how reliable the radial engines had remained even after years of abuse. One maintenance report famously read, "R-975 still starts on first try." In the halls of the Pentagon, analysts and generals began dissecting what the war had taught them. Among the most repeated lessons was this: mobility equals victory. The Wright radial engine, originally an improvisation, had become a case study in how speed and reliability could outweigh brute force. American war planners understood that their success wasn't just industrial scale. It was adaptability. Where others sought perfection, the U.S. had sought practicality. A simple idea, using an aircraft engine in a tank, had accelerated the entire Allied advance. "We won the ground war with engines meant for the sky," wrote one military historian in 1946. The line appeared in an early issue of Armored Cavalry Review, summing up the improbable genius of the decision. To future generations, it would seem almost poetic. Meanwhile, engineers back home studied post-war data. They found that the radial's air-cooled design had reduced maintenance time by nearly 40% compared to liquid-cooled tank engines. Its simplicity had saved thousands of man-hours. In the brutal arithmetic of war, that efficiency had meant more tanks rolling, fewer stranded. The lessons shaped the next era of tank design. American engineers realized that raw speed could be as valuable as firepower. The M26 Pershing, introduced at the end of the war, carried a more powerful engine. Not a radial, but a direct descendant of the same philosophy: compact, efficient, and easy to maintain. As the Cold War began, these principles evolved into the M46 and M47 Patton series, each embodying the legacy of the Sherman's airborne heart. The transition from radial to V-type engines didn't erase the past. It refined it. Engineers still whispered about the flying tank that had proved the impossible could work. In Europe, the sound of radial engines faded from the battlefield but not from history. British and French mechanics who had maintained Lend-Lease Shermans marveled at how long those engines lasted. Some remained operational well into the 1950s, used by smaller armies or stored in depots as emergency armor. Israel, newly founded in 1948, would later inherit and upgrade some of these Shermans. The Israeli Defense Force nicknamed them Super Shermans, keeping many of the original air-cooled radials before replacing them with modern power plants. Even then, veterans described the old Wright engines as nearly indestructible. In museums decades later, curators would start them up for demonstrations. Crowds gathered as the engines coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. A ghostly sound from another age. Children covered their ears, smiling. For a few seconds, it was as if the battlefield had awakened again. Back in America, the factories that had built the engines shifted to peacetime work. Wright Aeronautical merged into Curtiss-Wright Corporation, producing civilian engines and parts for airliners. Many of the same workers who had assembled tank engines now helped power the dawn of commercial flight. The irony wasn't lost on them. "We took the war to the ground," said one retired engineer, "and then we brought the peace back to the sky." His words reflected a larger truth, that innovation, once unleashed, rarely stays confined to a single purpose. The R-975 had proven not just its mechanical worth, but its philosophical one. It stood as a symbol of resourcefulness, a reminder that genius often hides in reusing what already exists. The U.S. didn't invent a new tank. It reimagined one with what it had on hand. In military academies, the story became a case study. Cadets were taught that technological advantage doesn't always come from new inventions. Sometimes it comes from bold application. The Shermans with airplane engines, instructors said, demonstrated that creativity can defeat complexity. Meanwhile, German post-war engineers studying captured Shermans expressed quiet admiration. One of them, a former designer from Henschel, makers of the Tiger, reportedly remarked, "They made something that ran everywhere. We made something that ran only in theory." His honesty spoke volumes. As Europe rebuilt, so did memory. For many veterans, the war's roar lived on in dreams. They remembered not just the danger, but the rhythm, that deep, throbbing pulse of the radial engine that seemed to echo their own heartbeat. "When I hear an airplane now," one veteran said decades later, "I still think of my tank." Hollywood, too, found fascination in the story. War films of the 1950s and 60s often featured Sherman tanks, their engines dubbed with aircraft sounds for authenticity. To audiences, it added drama. To veterans, it was nostalgia. They could almost smell the oil and cordite again. Yet for all the glory, the Shermans and their engines were not perfect. They had burned fuel at an alarming rate, forcing the Allies to refine supply logistics to near miraculous efficiency. But that challenge, too, had become part of the legend, a logistical triumph that mirrored the tank's mechanical endurance. Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system that supplied Patton's advance, existed partly because those engines could never rest. They demanded constant feeding, and they got it. In return, they pushed the front line faster than any army in history had moved. Engineers later credited the Wright radial with helping the Allies understand the future of mechanized warfare. Not slow giants, but mobile swarms. Decades later, that same idea would inspire NATO's doctrine of flexible response, the belief that agility could defeat might. The Soviet Union, studying American post-war reports, took notice as well. Their T-54 series focused on low-weight, high-speed, and easily replaceable engines. In an indirect way, the Sherman's airplane heart had influenced not only Western but also Eastern tank design. In the 1950s, as the Korean War erupted, American tank units once again relied on designs that owed their lineage to the Wright radial. The M46 Patton's Continental AV 1790 engine, liquid-cooled but conceptually similar, embodied the same obsession with reliability and thrust. Once more, American armor proved faster and more durable in difficult terrain. It is said that technology moves in circles. And perhaps that's why the circular shape of the Wright radial became symbolic in military engineering diagrams for decades. It represented not just mechanical balance, but philosophical one. Power distributed equally, adaptable in every direction. As years passed, many of the men who built, maintained, and fought in those tanks grew old. Some kept fragments, a switch, a throttle handle, or even a small cylinder head, as souvenirs. They'd bring them out for grandchildren, tapping the metal softly and saying, "This once flew, and then it fought." Museums across America began restoring surviving Shermans. The Smithsonian, the National Armor and Cavalry Museum, and smaller local institutions all displayed models featuring the Wright R-975. Visitors marveled at how something designed for the clouds could fit so neatly inside a tank's armored shell. Curators often ran demonstration videos showing both the airplane and tank versions of the engine running side by side. The similarity in sound astonished audiences. It was, as one visitor commented, like listening to history breathe. Veterans' reunions became quieter with each passing decade, but whenever one of those engines started up for a parade or event, old men would stand straighter, eyes shining. The noise wasn't just mechanical, it was emotional, a sound that had carried them through the darkest chapter of their lives. Scholars today argue that the real legacy of the airplane engine tanks lies beyond mechanics. It lies in mindset. America's willingness to improvise under pressure, to blend two worlds that never should have met, exemplified the spirit that defined the Allied victory. "We didn't win because we had the best machines," said General Omar Bradley in a post-war interview. "We won because we kept them running." Those words echo through military history like a verdict, a reminder that endurance is sometimes the ultimate weapon. The Wright R-975 and its Sherman descendants became icons of that endurance. They represented the intersection of air and ground, innovation and necessity. In a way, they symbolized America itself, ambitious, experimental, and often underestimated. Even in peacetime, their DNA persisted. Post-war aircraft engines, transport vehicles, and even industrial generators borrowed principles tested inside those armored hulls. The boundary between air and land had blurred forever. In classrooms, young engineers studied the radial as a marvel of simplicity. Its modular cylinders and symmetrical design became examples of wartime ingenuity. Professors reminded students that innovation often begins not with invention, but with reimagination. One student, decades later, would grow up to design hybrid engines for space exploration. When asked about his inspiration, he cited the Shermans of World War II. "They took a sky engine and made it crawl through mud," he said. "That's the kind of thinking we need in every era." By the 21st century, only a handful of working R-975-powered Shermans remained, yet each was a living monument. When their engines fired up, the air shimmered with the same raw vibration that once rolled across France and Germany. People came from miles away to hear it, a sound not of destruction, but of determination. History often forgets the small decisions that change everything. Mounting airplane engines on tanks may sound trivial, even eccentric, but it altered the pace of an entire war. It turned stalemate into motion, and motion into victory. For the men who rode those machines, the sound of the radial meant hope. For historians, it means ingenuity. And for everyone else, it's a reminder that sometimes the path to progress lies in daring to do what seems absurd. "If it flies, it fights," one wartime engineer had joked. He was half right. The engine flew before it fought, and then it won a war on the ground. The Wright R-975 may no longer shake the earth, but its heartbeat continues in every innovation that dares to break boundaries. From aircraft turbines to space engines, the philosophy remains the same: reuse, adapt, overcome. And somewhere in the quiet of a museum hangar or the open field of a Veterans Memorial Day, that heartbeat still echoes, faint, steady, eternal. The war had long ended, but the story of the flying tank still lingered like a distant echo, one that refused to fade. Across generations, engineers, historians, and ordinary dreamers kept returning to it, fascinated by how something so strange, so unlikely, could change the course of history. It was not just a story about engines and steel, it was a story about imagination. When people visit museums today, they often stand before the Sherman and wonder what made it special. At first glance, it looks ordinary. A squat green machine with worn tracks and rivets dulled by time. But those who know, those who've heard the roar of a radial engine starting up, understand the secret. That sound wasn't just mechanical, it was a heartbeat. In a quiet hangar in Fort Benning, Georgia, one of the few surviving R-975 Shermans still rests. Each year, mechanics gather to wake it from slumber. They turn the crank, check the fuel, and then, a cough, a sputter, and the same thunder that once shook Europe returns. The air fills with the deep, rolling growl of 9 pistons spinning in perfect rhythm. For a moment, history breathes again. Veterans who come to hear it often close their eyes. To them, that sound isn't noise, it's memory. They see the hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen forests of Belgium, the dusty roads of France. They remember friends, fear, laughter, and the strange comfort of knowing that as long as the engine roared, they still had a chance. The audience watching can feel it too. The vibration in the floor, the trembling air, the invisible line connecting past and present. It's a bridge of sound, linking the factory workers of 1942 with the listeners of today. It reminds everyone that behind every victory, there was someone who dared to think differently. The Wright R-975 was never meant for tanks. It was born to lift planes into the clouds. Yet in war, destiny often takes unexpected turns. When the world needed something more, something that could move faster, endure longer, and break the stalemate, that airplane heart answered the call. The real miracle wasn't that it worked. It was that people believed it could. In the darkest days of the war, when resources were thin and hope thinner, American engineers refused to surrender to convention. They looked at a problem everyone else had given up on, and simply turned it sideways. Innovation doesn't ask permission, one wartime designer once said. It asks, what if? Those 2 words changed everything. What if an airplane engine could drive a tank? What if speed could replace armor? What if creativity could defeat complexity? And in answering those questions, they built an engine that didn't just move machines, it moved history itself. Every revolution starts with doubt. The Sherman's radial engine faced ridicule before it faced the enemy. Experts called it impractical. Traditionalists called it reckless. But when the first tank roared across the test field, the noise drowned out every critic. Progress, it turned out, was loud. That loudness became a weapon of morale. Allied soldiers said they could hear the Shermans coming long before they appeared, and it gave them courage. The sound meant help was on the way. Civilians hiding in cellars heard the same noise and whispered, "The Americans are here." For them, that roar meant freedom. Even their enemies learned to recognize it. To German troops, it was the sound of inevitability, the mechanical storm that no fortification could hold back. Many later admitted that when they first heard what they thought were aircraft engines on the horizon, panic set in. The air and ground seemed to merge, and defeat felt certain. History often celebrates grand inventions: rockets, jets, atomic breakthroughs. Yet sometimes it's the modest repurposing of an old idea that makes the difference. The Wright radial engine didn't change physics, but it changed momentum. It proved that innovation can be humble, practical, and still world-shaping. After the war, as nations rebuilt, engineers carried those lessons forward. The jet age, the space race, and the digital revolution all owed something to that wartime mindset. Adapt fast, test faster, and never dismiss the impossible. The same courage that turned a plane engine into a tank engine would later send humans to the moon. The men who worked those machines rarely saw themselves as heroes. They were mechanics, welders, soldiers, ordinary people doing extraordinary things under extraordinary pressure. But their work built bridges between disciplines, between airfields and tank depots, between the clouds and the mud. In their success lies a simple truth. Creativity thrives under constraint. The tighter the box, the stronger the imagination that breaks out of it. The Americans didn't have time to design perfection. They had to design something that worked. And in doing so, they redefined what working meant. When modern engineers study the wartime blueprints, they still shake their heads. The math is crude, the materials outdated, but the spirit behind it is timeless. You can almost feel the urgency in every handwritten note and grease-stained margin. Try this, maybe this will fit. It was invention on instinct. And somehow, that instinct was enough. The tanks moved, the lines broke, the war shifted. Every victory that followed carried the faint smell of aviation oil, proof that inspiration can cross boundaries when survival demands it. The legacy of the airplane-powered Sherman isn't just mechanical, it's moral. It tells us that creativity and courage are inseparable, that genius doesn't live in laboratories alone, but in workshops, trenches, and even in the minds of tired mechanics staring at impossible problems. Decades after the last radial-powered tank retired, a journalist asked a veteran what it felt like to drive one. The old tanker smiled. "It felt like flying," he said simply. And maybe that was the point. That even on the ground, humanity has always been reaching upward. The airplane heart of the Sherman became a metaphor for America's spirit. Restless, resourceful, and relentless. It refused to stall, even when conditions turned dire. In that way, it became more than machinery. It became a lesson in endurance. That lesson still matters today. Every time an engineer looks at an old problem and dares to solve it in a new way, the echo of that radial engine returns. Every time someone says, "It can't be done," and someone else answers, "Watch me." That's the same spirit that once roared across Normandy. History, after all, is not just a list of events. It's a mirror, reflecting the choices people make when there's no clear answer. The Wright radial was one of those choices. It wasn't perfect, but it was brave. And in the crucible of war, bravery often matters more than perfection. Walk up to a Sherman today and touch the cool steel. You can almost feel the vibration still trapped inside. Imagine the factory workers who built it. Teenagers, mothers, immigrants, all united by the sound of engines testing in the night. They didn't know it, but they were building history with every bolt. Their work reminds us that war, terrible as it is, often reveals humanity's best qualities: cooperation, invention, resilience. The Wright radial engine was all three. A global collaboration of minds from aviation, manufacturing, and field mechanics. It was humanity improvising under pressure and succeeding. As the decades roll on, technology moves further from pistons and gears. The world now hums with the quiet precision of electric motors and computer algorithms. Yet in the background, the echo of the radial still lingers, the memory of an age when progress roared. Historians sometimes call the Second World War the last great mechanical war. After it came electronics, then automation, then data. But in that mechanical era, the relationship between man and machine was visceral, physical, intimate. Every push of a throttle was felt in the bones. That intimacy is what gives the Sherman story its enduring power. It wasn't about software or circuitry. It was about sweat, courage, and steel. The airplane engine inside the tank wasn't just technology. It was humanity's determination made audible. Standing in front of one today, You might wonder how something so simple could have carried such weight. But simplicity is often deceptive. The Wright R-975 was a symphony of balance, each cylinder firing like a heartbeat in perfect rotation. It was art disguised as machinery, and when that art met necessity, history moved. From that unlikely union came speed, victory, and an enduring lesson. When creativity meets courage, there are no impossible combinations. That's why, 80 years later, this story still resonates. It reminds us that progress is never linear. It comes from collisions between air and land, logic and madness, failure and persistence. It comes from daring to say, "Let's try." The Wright radial didn't just power tanks, it powered possibility. It turned skepticism into strategy, chaos into coordination. It turned a question mark into an exclamation point. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. Not in the roar of engines, but in the hum of innovation that surrounds us every day. Every breakthrough carries a faint echo of that sound from 1944, whispering, "Move forward." And maybe that's the real legacy. Not what the engine did, but what it inspired. Because every generation faces its own battlefield, and every battlefield demands its own invention. The lesson remains the same: adapt, improvise, and never stop moving. From the burning deserts of Tunisia to the forests of France, from the skies of the Pacific to the frozen roads of Belgium, the same heartbeat carried on. The heart of a plane, the soul of a tank, the courage of the people who dared to combine them. Their story belongs not just to history books, but to all of us who still believe that impossible problems have beautiful solutions. It's a story about sound, the sound of motion, of defiance, of hope. And as long as that sound is remembered, the spirit of the flying tank will never truly fade. It will live wherever machines move and people dream. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary victories begin with a question loud enough to shake the ground. What if we gave a tank the heart of an airplane? The answer, as history proved, was everything. If you enjoyed this story, the tale of how a crazy idea changed the course of World War II, make sure to subscribe to Victory Shadows for more true stories of courage, ingenuity, and forgotten innovations that shaped history. Leave a comment below. Did you know about the flying tanks before this video? And tell us, which other forgotten wartime inventions do you want us to explore next? Until next time, remember, history isn't just in the past. It's the engine still driving us forward.